Well, Fridays appear to be our WARNO Dev blog day going forward, as we've had 3 on a Friday now so far. Today's is focused on the story rather than anything about the game specifically, though they do talk a little bit about some of the game stuff further down. Let's focus on the story first. So, in the real world, Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party in Soviet Union in 1985. That's the same here. However, in the real world, he stayed in that position until 1991 when he resigned. In Eugen's WARNO version of history, he was removed from power in a bloodless military coup in April 1987. Following this, the position of the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was replaced with a troika, in this case a group of 3 men, one representing the party, one the KGB, and one the army or military. Now, I will state that obviously there are going to be strong feelings one way or other with any of this type of storyline. And I'd just like to stress at this point, I'm not taking any political points or views here. I am just literally going to read out the rest of what they've said about their story. So they say the reason for this coup was that Mikhail Gorbachev was introducing democratization and also political transparency into the Soviet society and alienated the old guard, who were the ones who then overthrew him. Following this coup in 1987, the Soviet Union was brought back to heel, and any trace of political overture was quickly forgotten. Unrest in the Baltic states and Armenia was crushed without remorse. Even neutral Finland, though not a Soviet state, but with press and political establishment, having grown openly critic of the Soviet Union under Gorbachev's short rule, it was brought back into line in a covert move reminiscent of Czechoslovakian President Dubček's forced resignation after the Prague Spring of 1968. The then neutral Finnish government is forced to include a majority of pro-Soviet members, thrusting the country into Moscow's sphere of influence under a very clear threat of arms. The so-called Helsinki coup of 1987 was the trigger for a further worsening and renewed tension between the West and East. The US President Ronald Reagan, in outrage, annulled the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement, which was about to be signed, widening the gap between the 2 major powers. Following the advice of his most hawkish advisors, Reagan initiated a second phase of the so-called New Cold War he devised in the early 80s. An even more aggressive posturing of Western Europe is instigated, which includes the funding of counterinsurgencies, defense armament deals with old and new allies alike. Western economic sanctions and rising military expenditure forced the Soviet Union into ever worse trade deals, inflating its already crippling debts. Oil reserves are dangerously low, and food shortages throughout the zone of influence, including Eastern Europe and the Baltics, are barely averted. Meanwhile, the Troika and its Warsaw Pact's most hardline allies strengthen their hold on their respective countries, squashing the rising wave of dissent and peaceful civil groups. East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania become even more repressive. In Poland, Wojciech Jaselski tightens his grip on the country with an even harsher martial law. And then in 1989, both the UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and the new US President George W. Bush, who succeeded Reagan, greatly admonished the Soviet Union's violent crackdowns on its citizens and promised a greatly renewed effort in the fight for freedom and democracy. New armament deals, support for democratic groups behind the Iron Curtain, mobilization plans, and technology advancements are revealed. The pace of war accelerates rapidly. Overtly, NATO takes a cautious approach, but in secret rearms and prepares for a potential conflict in Western Germany. At the start of 1989, the largest ever version of the Reforger exercises were announced for September that year. The leaders of the then Soviet Union became paranoid and believed that this was an elaborate smokescreen for a land conflict in Western Europe. The Warsaw Pact deemed to be only minutes away from full NATO invasion, the Soviet Union sees no other option but war. Under the cover of its own massive exercise in East Germany announced for the end of June, Zapad 89, the Warsaw Pact mobilizes its forces. The whole month of May into June sees massive troop movements, chiefly on the eastern side of the inner German border. Even after official conclusion, the armies remain active. Then suddenly, on the 20th of June, there was the withdrawal of the German border guards. War is coming home. June 21st, 1989, 7:05 AM, the offensive begins. And that is the premise of the story. Apparently it is going to be a lot more detailed than that in-game, and if you read the documentation that comes with the game, but that is the basic overview that we're getting for now. So next we move on to where the battles are actually taking place. The focus is on central Germany initially, around the infamous Faluda Gap. The Faluda Gap was a natural corridor between the Vogelsberg north and the Rhone and Spessart or south mountain ranges, running along the Kingsing River Valley. It was an obvious point of passage for any army moving east and west, or the other way around. Napoleon used it as a route to retreat after his defeat in Leipzig in 1813, and the Americans drove through it the other way in the last month of World War II to meet the Soviets as far east as possible. For the same reason, during the Cold War, the Faluda Gap was regarded as one of two possible focal points for a Soviet invasion of West Germany, the other being the North German plains, in the area of responsibility of the British Army of the Rhine. As such, the Faluda Gap and this sector of the Iron Curtain was one of the most guarded and militarized in the world during the Cold War. NATO's forward defense in this area was CENTAG, an army-sized formation with a mission to hold the Faluda Gap long enough for further NATO reinforcements to be mobilized to counterattack. It controlled 4 army corps, both American and West German, with possible additional reinforcements coming from the rear and other NATO members. On the other side of the Iron Curtain stood elements of the mighty Soviet Western Group forces, more specifically the 8th Guards Army, acting as the spearhead for any Warsaw Pact invasion, with the 1st Guards Tank Army earmarked for close support. The East German 3rd Army was also present, although historically wouldn't have been used as a separate command, but rather its assets would have been used as a support force for the Soviet armies depending on the situation. This setting will be the background for Warno's featured army general campaigns and scripted scenarios, pitting NATO's CENTAG against the Warsaw Pact's Western Group forces, while army general campaigns and scenarios will focus on historical divisions and formations from both CENTAG and the WGF. The multiplayer battle groups and units will be drawn from a wider area, including Reforger units, some French and some British troops being featured under the NATO banner, and additional Western Group forces assets for the Warsaw Pact, so you won't just be limited to the Americans, Western Germany, and the Soviets and East Germany. Now that that's out the way, we get a little bit of information on what is going to be in Warno when it is finally released. Firstly, there will be 4 army general campaigns set in CENTAG's theatre of operation, featuring all the US, Soviet, East and West Germany divisions, and yes, independent units too, such as, let's say, cavalry regiments, and units historically stationed in this area. That's a massive order of battle, down not to just the company level as currently in Steel Division 2, but now to a platoon level as well. And of course, all of these will be playable from both sides in solo, co-op or versus. There will also be a number of scripted scenarios. These are not strategic campaigns, but rather specific tactical scenarios. Unlike skirmish, these missions will have specific briefings with special settings, deployment and or victory rules to present a different challenge, etc, etc. Also playable from both sides in solo, co-op and versus. There's something very similar with historical battles in SD2. Although the initial army general campaigns will focus on CENTAG and the Western Group forces, that is the US and West Germany versus Soviet and East German forces, there will of course be 6 nations playable in multiplayer. That will be the USA, West Germany, the USSR and East Germany, as well as the French and the UK. In this way, they will have most of the Cold War's major weapon manufacturers and nations covered. There will be 16 historical battle groups, each corresponding to a real-life division or brigade, with all its combat equipment, vehicles, units, variants, camouflage patterns, weapons, voice acting, and both NATO and Warsaw Pact nations were organized and trained to operate together on the battlefield. You can expect allied units to be included within certain battle groups, be it in air support or full firepower of a foreign brigade. However, they say they will return to that in a later dev blog. There will be over 600 units with major improvements in modeling and weapons FX combat sounds over previous games. They then go on to say that that's quite a lot, but that they know us and that we will be asking about Poland and Czechoslovakia. And why only CENTAG and not Northag or Southag? Well, they tell us not to worry, they haven't been forgotten, but they just can't do everything at once. Northag and Southag will be featured at a later date as Army General Campaigns DLC. Basically, it's a lot like what happened with Steel Division 2. And they will get their own massive and exhaustive OOBs, AG campaign maps, and scenario-specific units and nations. Northag under British command will cover combat in northern German plains, and focus specifically on the British and Polish, and possibly some others. Although Southag didn't exist anymore since France's withdrawal from NATO's Integrated Military Command in 1966, exercises had been held in the late 80s to anticipate its quick recreation in case of a war in Germany. With the 1st French Army at its core, it would have taken over command of the southern part of Centag, with some German and US troops under its control, and it will focus specifically on the French and Czechoslovakia, and again a few others. And that's the end of the dev blog, so we now know how the campaigns are going to work to some extent, and we know the basis for the whole story of the game. Now they've left us with this very nice GIF showing off some scenery and saying see you next week. So at a wild guess, I assume we're going to be learning about the maps and the land we'll be playing on, and how it's improved since previous games in terms of how nice the scenery looks. So watch this space. Now before next week's blog, I'll be putting up a video taking a look at divisions and exactly what they are in Steel Division 2. So for those like me that had never played Steel Division 2, we get an idea of what to expect in WARNO from these divisions rather than standard deck building. Well, all that's left to say is thanks for watching, please do like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you all next week.